It might not be saying much, but the Intel Arc B570 is probably the most attractive graphics card at its price point right now. You get 10GB of VRAM with hardware RT, upscaling and frame generation for around £180. The only direct competitors right now are on old architectures, lack at least one modern feature, and probably have no more than 6GB of VRAM. Of course, if you're open to buying second-hand, you could use that same budget to buy the greatest graphics card of all time. You've probably heard me or one of my colleagues on the internet refer to the 2017 GeForce GTX 1080 Ti as the GOAT. And while there is some hyperbole to that statement, there's a lot of emotional truth to it. The 1080 Ti was from a more pure, innocent time in PC gaming, before we all got overwhelmed by unchecked capitalism and its corruption of all we hold dear. Plus, it's a flagship that can still run 9 out of 10 modern PC games, despite being nearly a decade old, and it's fallen from its £700 launch price to around 150 to 200 quid. There are precisely 0 new graphics cards at that price that have 11GB of VRAM, and nowadays there are games where that actually matters. There is, however, one new graphics card in this price bracket that has 10GB of VRAM, which is near enough that you'd hope it wouldn't make much of a difference. The Arc B570 is the little brother to the B580, and I have high hopes for it. It's almost unfair comparing it to the other options around this price, which consist of the much reviled 6GB RTX 3050 and the 4GB RX 6400 and 6500 XT, the latter of which I think is a travesty, and the little brother only gets a pass because it's available in bus-powered variants. The test rig is the formerly moderately priced gaming PC with a Ryzen 5 7500F and 32GB of DDR5 6000. Although these days the RAM alone is worth more than either graphics card. What more appropriate game could there be to test an Intel Arc than Arc Raiders? Well, as I've never played the game before, or indeed any other game in this genre, it was a slightly daunting task, and I'm not really sure what I'm doing. Still, I managed to get a decent amount of time recorded on the same map, so while they might not be perfect numbers, I think they're relatively representative of what you can expect. The B570 really impressed me here, averaging 92 FPS at 1080 high with XeAA and static lighting, and with high RTGI enabled it only drops to 79. There are higher settings, but this game is potentially a competitive shooter, depending on you and the people you play against, so I'm guessing most players wouldn't want to risk an inferior experience in exchange for maybe some nicer looking rubble? Looking at the 1080 Ti, and in another context, this would be pretty positive stuff. This is a 2025 game running at 1080 high settings on an 8-year-old graphics card and still managing 75 FPS without even having to touch upscaling. Of course, I'm not appreciating the GOAT for its longevity in this video, I'm comparing it for value to the B570. And it kinda doesn't. It's 20% behind the new card at the same settings, and the B570 with ray tracing comfortably matches the 1080 Ti without. Intel is currently running a free game promo with the B570 in the UK, and one of the options is Dying Light the Beast, which is the one I selected. It's actually half the reason I bought the GPU at all. With that in mind, you would hope that the Arc can handle it, and I guess it kinda does. The outdoor areas are pretty demanding, so that's where I prefer to run my benchmark, and that sees an average of 61 FPS at native 1080 high. Lows are in the 40s, so you could drop to the medium preset for a more consistent 60 FPS experience, but it's not the only option. This game does support Intel's XeSS upscaling, and if you're not against that kind of technology on principle, then there's no reason not to use it. The maximum setting is Ultra Plus, which reduces the render resolution by a factor of 1.3 times and increases the average FPS to 77 and lows to just under 60. The 1080 Ti can also use XeSS, as well as FSR, which does more or less the same thing. However, it doesn't have the necessary hardware to get the good version. That means you still get the performance boost of upscaling, but you don't get quite the same image quality as with the hardware accelerated version. With settings matched, the 1080 Ti is once again about 20% behind the B570, failing to hit 50 FPS at native resolution and only scraping 60 with XeSS Ultra Plus. Another option in the free game promo is Assassin's Creed Shadows, but I don't have the best news on that front. At native 1080 high, you're looking at a fairly solid 30 plus experience, with an average of 41. XeSS upscaling doesn't really give the kind of boost you'd need to hit 60. In fact, you'd need to drop quality to very low and still use some XeSS to get there. You could always use frame generation, and my own feelings about that tech are mellowing somewhat lately, but I'm still not going to tell you it's the answer to your performance problems. How does the Arc compare to the GOAT? Pretty well, as a matter of fact, averaging between 10 and 20% higher depending on the settings, and of course the Arc has the image quality advantage thanks to that full-fat XMX powered version of XeSS upscaling. Of the 4 choices of free game, the third option is Battlefield 6. The fourth is Civ 7, but I don't own that one and you only get to choose one freebie. I tested both GPUs in the multiplayer conquest mode on the Liberation Peak map, and at native 1080 high settings, the Arc delivers 82 FPS, with 1% just scraping below the 60 mark. Meanwhile, the 1080 Ti is still playable, and not even in a borderline way, but actually genuinely enjoyable. But still 15% behind the new card. I started testing The Last of Us Part 2 at maximum settings, and I thought it was going really well. Too well, as it turns out. When I reached this clearing, the B570 made a familiar faceplant? What the f***? The B570 made a familiar faceplant that I often see with lower VRAM cards. The nice 50 plus experience turns into a choppy mess. It could probably be avoided simply by dropping shadow and texture quality, or adding a small amount of upscaling, but I found using the high preset rather than very high did the trick. The difference between the budget Arc and the old GeForce flagship is over 20% here, though at very high, the 11GB card didn't fall apart quite so spectacularly. It's funny that this was the only game today where 11GB was enough, but 10GB wasn't. But I guess if it was going to be any game, it was going to be this one. Kingdom Come 2 is another strong title for the B570. I wouldn't consider the experimental preset to be on the table, but it can manage Ultra with a 61 FPS average, and if you prefer a little insurance in case things get more demanding further down the road, High still looks good and averages over 80 FPS. The difference between the B570 and the 1080 Ti is smaller here than in some others, but it's still 15% in favour of the Arc. I don't even know why I bother featuring Spider-Man 2 anymore, it's never going to get any better, but I guess it still needs to be said. Minute-to-minute gameplay feels fine, but traversal can be extremely stuttery, and you need a beast of a PC to achieve a flat 60 all of the time. Even at 1080 medium, the B570 can only manage a 67 FPS average overall, and the lowest 1% of frames average just 30. Meanwhile, the old GeForce is a respectable 10% lower at the same settings. Intel have been particularly focused on making sure their Arc cards perform well in Cyberpunk 2077. Probably because us reviewers still feature the game heavily in our benchmarks. In that regard, it's been a big success. The B570 is 20% faster at 1080 high, averaging over 90 FPS to the 1080 Ti's 75. The B570 can also manage to enable ray tracing. and while you could probably get decent results with RT low or medium, I don't believe that either of those presets are actually worth the expense. RT Ultra looks great, and with quality XeSS, rendering internally at 635p, it can achieve almost 60 FPS. Not an ideal experience, but a tolerable one, and one that can't be replicated on a GTX card. Both cards are more than capable of high performance in GTA 5 Enhanced Edition. At the very high preset, they're within 5 frames of each other at around the 130 FPS mark, and could easily handle higher resolutions than 1080p. The B570, however, can leverage that performance to enable ray tracing, and it doesn't even need upscaling to do so. At native 1080 very high RT mode, it averages 83 FPS, with lows a hair under 60. Marvel Rivals is my third UE5 title of the video. Sorry to all the Epic haters out there, I'll try to do better next time. This game is not one to play at high settings and native resolution, but one of these two cards can handle it, while the other one can't, at least not in a way you'd enjoy. The B570 finishes the demo with an average a shade under 60 FPS, while the 1080 Ti is below 50. The 1% lows aren't great on either card, but they're close to 30 on the GeForce. Improving performance is a matter of either upscaling or dropping quality, and I chose the latter. This brings the 1080 Ti up over 60 FPS on average, but the B570 is now reaching 80. At this point in the video, I have to mention a couple of games which could be considered unfair tests. Indiana Jones and Doom: The Dark Ages both require ray tracing hardware to even run, so the GTX 1080 Ti is immediately disqualified from competing. I'm still including them in the review because they are a reason to go for the B570 over the GeForce, and it's worth knowing how well the card actually performs before you buy it. On the other hand, Indy wasn't that well received, and I didn't hear as much hype for Doom as its predecessors, so there's a strong chance that these games just don't matter to you. Still, they probably won't be the last games to require RT hardware. Indy looks pretty good, but we still don't really have enough memory to go past medium. You could probably push up to high by dropping shadow and texture quality, but even at medium we're averaging 61 FPS and frequently dipping below that, so there's not a ton of headroom. Adding Ultra plus upscaling, which is pretty much rendering at 830p, increases the average to 73 and 1% lows to 54. Finally, Doom: The Dark Ages is another one that won't start on the GTX card, and also has exceptionally high memory demands. At native 1080p low, the first section of the first level can manage just over 60 FPS. As we have the XMX cores, it's a shame not to use them, and I use them to bump up the quality setting to Nightmare. XeSS quality is a 1.7 times scaling factor, in line with DLSS balanced, so the internal resolution is once more down to 635p, but we're getting nicer effects and better textures, and only losing a couple of frames in the process. So here's the bottom line. The Intel Arc B570 offers 15 to 20% better performance than the GTX 1080 Ti, with hardware ray tracing that doesn't suck, and hardware upscaling and frame generation. You get a new card with a warranty, and if you're in the UK and buy around the time this video goes live, you'll get a free game worth about a third of the value of the card, and also enjoy lower power consumption to boot. You could argue that the Pascal flagship is more mature and has the benefit of years of driver development, but as of a few days ago, this generation of GPU will no longer receive future game optimizations via drivers. Meanwhile, Intel have been playing catch-up over the last few years, battling to get their GPUs optimized for the latest games and existing ones, and apparently they seem to have been succeeding. I want to like Arc. I want Intel to be a genuine competitor to AMD and Nvidia for those of us who don't want to support their antics anymore. And I'm glad that there's a sub £200 graphics card on the new market that's actually worth buying. However, I do want to be respectful to the GTX 1080 Ti, not only for its value as a top-end GPU in the pre-RTX days, but also for its longevity as a useful graphics card. However, there's only one winner here. If you are spending £200 on a graphics card in 2025 or 2026, it shouldn't be on a near-decade-old one, even if it is the GOAT. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.